Today we are learning how to quote accurately from a text when explaining what the text says explicitly and when drawing inferences from the text. We will be successful when we can identify explicit text evidence that supports an inference that was made, and quote text evidence that is either explicit or implicit that supports an inference. Now, explicit just means that it's right there. It's straight there in the text. You can find it and see it. Implicit means that you kind of have to think about it, and it's implied. Night of the Spadefoot Toads. Chapter 6. Ben opens the front door the moment the bell rings. His mom comes up behind him in the doorway. Mrs. Tibbetts is dressed in old jeans, a brown canvas jacket, and the same leather hiking boots she wears at school. "Hello, Ben. And you must be Mrs. Maroney. I'm Gloria Tibbetts." She holds out her hand. "I'm so happy you called," his mom says as she shakes the teacher's hand. "Would you like me to pick him up?" "Oh, no, no," the teacher says. "I'll bring him right back after we get the work done and have a bite to eat." Mrs. Tibbetts' car is a beat-up old station wagon. Ben has trouble getting the passenger door open until Mrs. Tibbetts opens it from the inside. "Darn door," she says. "I don't use it much." Inside, the car is like a storage shed that hasn't been cleaned out for a long time. The back seat is folded down to make more room for all the stacked up boxes and plastic containers. Boots and raincoats are piled on top of the boxes. Spades and shovels and nets, like the one used for hauling in fish after they've caught them, have been thrown in anywhere they'll fit. Mrs. Tibbetts gathers the books and papers from the passenger seat and crams them between two boxes in the back. "There, this'll do for now," she says. "But I need to clean this car out in the worst way. It's worse than my desk. Worse than my brain." She laughs an easy, comfortable laugh. Ben doesn't mind the mess. He looks in the back seat, remembering Mr. Tompkins at the Desert Museum and all the equipment the people were used there. While he's looking, Mrs. Tibbetts keeps talking. "I really appreciate your help today. I know kids don't like to give up their Saturdays, but I have to move some things around in the yard, and I just can't do it all by myself. You'll see. Hopefully no one will bother us, and we can get some work done." Mrs. Tibbetts checks the rearview mirror and backs out of his driveway. "You can open the window if you want." Ben rolls the window down. The air is warm, and the sun is shining. There aren't any leaves on the trees yet, but it feels like things are coming back to life. He looks over at Mrs. Tibbetts as she drives. He's never ridden in a teacher's car before, let alone been to a teacher's house. "Will your husband be there to help too?" he asks. Mrs. Tibbetts keeps her eyes on the road. "My husband died last year, so I'm afraid he won't be much help today. If he could, he would. He loved being outdoors." Ben swallows. He feels horrible. He should have figured that out by himself. That's why she left school for a while. He fumbles for something to say, but Mrs. Tibbetts keeps talking. "I really do need help. That's why I asked. And it sounds like you enjoy being outside." Ben nods. "In Tucson, I spent a lot of time outdoors. A lot by myself, and with my friend Toby." It's Mrs. Tibbetts' turn to nod. It strikes Ben that they're both talking about someone they've lost, though moving away from your best friend is nothing like losing someone you're married to. He sneaks another look at Mrs. Tibbetts. Maybe that's why her eyes look sad, even when she laughs. She keeps looking straight ahead. He can't think of anything else to say. "You live pretty close to me as the crow flies," Mrs. Tibbetts says. "Those woods behind your house connect to the woods behind mine, although it would be hard to find your way through. But I have a lot of frogs on my property too, several different kinds." It's better when she's doing all the talking, Ben thinks. She goes on. "American toads will be coming out pretty soon, and even some spadefoots." Spadefoots? Ben has heard of spadefoots, but he doesn't know much about them. "Right," Mrs. Tibbetts says. "Eastern spadefoots. They're very rare around here. This is as far north as they get. But we've got some." She turns off the main road onto a winding street. They drive past a wooded lot with no houses, and then pull into a driveway. He peers out the car window. The little house is set way back from the street, but there's hardly any lawn. Instead, there are bushes and trees and large flower beds covered with straw. The car comes to a stop and Ben gets out. He sees a one-car garage to his left, connected to the house by a covered walkway. A couple of bare, gnarled trees loom over the front porch. Looks like a pretty old house, Ben says. The oldest part is 140 years old, Mrs. Tibbetts says. Almost older than me. Ben looks at her. That's a joke, Mrs. Tibbetts says. Come around back and I'll show you what to do. They walk to the back of the house. It faces south, so the morning sun is reflecting off the window panes. The backyard stretches out into a meadow of tall, uncut, tawny grass, with woods at the far end. Small trees and bushes are arranged in rough lines over part of the meadow. Just beyond the garage, Ben sees what looks like a fenced-in vegetable garden with piles of brush and weeds heaped nearby. Off to the left, a hill rises steeply with a bare outcropping of rocks crowning its top. It looks like a great place to explore. As if reading his mind, Mrs. Tibbetts says, Want to look around a bit before we get to work? Sure. He follows his teacher out to the middle of the field, and they stop and stand by the rows of bushes. These are blueberries, Mrs. Tibbetts says, fingering one of the bare branches. The birds get most of them. Is this all your land? Yes, she says. Well, mine and my sister-in-law's. Ben looks back at the house. There's a big tool shed behind the garage. Is this a farm or something? He asks. It was, once upon a time. My husband's father farmed it, and his father did too. But they weren't serious farmers. It's hard to farm here because the soil is very rocky. A lot of the fields have gone back to woods by now. Anyway, Thomas inherited the house and the land right around it. It's where he grew up. He loved it here. Ben notices a little lean-to against the tool shed. A large cage up on its legs sits under the lean-to roof. It looks like a rabbit hutch. What's that? He asks, pointing. Mrs. Tibbetts shakes her head and says, It's a snake cage. Ben's ears perk up. Are there snakes in there? Yes. My husband kept them. What kind? It doesn't matter, Mrs. Tibbetts said. You must leave them alone and not go near them. But are they? I'm dead serious. Do not go near the cage. Do you understand me? Ben nods. He can tell she doesn't want to talk about it anymore. It only makes him more curious. Let's get to work, Mrs. Tibbetts says, so we'll have time later to look for the frogs. Mrs. Tibbetts opens the door of the tool shed. Wait here, I need to get a few things. Ben can't help staring at the cages. What could be in them? Mrs. Tibbetts hands Ben a rake and a big plastic tarp and leads him around to the large flower bed on the side of the house away from the garage. She instructs him to rake the leaves out of the bed and pile them up on the tarp. Then leaves him there to work in the sun. Soon he's sweating. Just as he's finished with the bed, she reappears and points out a pile of fallen branches. I want you to drag those limbs out to the back part of the field. Cover for animals, she says. A place they can hide from hawks. Ben can't remember the last time he worked this hard, but the morning goes by quickly. When he's moved all the branches out to the field, he sits on a rock wall and enjoys the sun for a minute. He's still breathing heavily, but a light breeze cools his face. Now that he's still, he can hear birds singing. All done? Mrs. Tibbetts calls. She has something that looks like deflated inner tubes draped over her shoulders. I think so, Ben answers. Let's go for a walk then, she says and holds up a really long pair of boots. We'll take these hip waders in case we want to wade in some muck. Ben has seen pictures of boots like these. but he's never worn any. He puts a pair over his shoulder and follows Mrs. Tibbetts. She stops at the edge of the woods and points to an opening in the trees. My husband made this trail years ago. It loops back around the woods and in a big circle and comes out near the garage, she says, then heads off down the trail at a quick pace. Before Ben knows it, Mrs. Tibbetts is down the path almost 20 yards ahead of him. Ben struggles along, lugging the big boots, following the faint trail. He pushes past a tangle of briars and fallen tree branches and nearly steps on Mrs. Tibbetts, who is kneeling by a log. She lifts it up slightly. Look, she says. Ben squats beside her. Huddled under the log is a little squirmy thing, a couple of inches long, with legs and a tail. It has yellow spots up and down its back. Ben gets down on his knees, right by Mrs. Tibbetts. What is it? A yellow spotted salamander. It's just waking up now. Ben is impressed. How'd you know it was there? Well, I wasn't sure, but they like moist places, and they usually burrow around roots, so I made an educated guess. She seems to know something about everything on this trail. She brushes back leaves and shows him where tiny white wildflowers called bloodroot are already blooming. She stops in front of a tree and breaks off a twig. Chew on the end of this, she says. Ben bites down on the twig and his mouth fills with a sudden sweetness. It tastes sort of minty. Black birch, Mrs. Tibbetts says. People used it to make root beer. It's also got a natural painkiller in it. Ben had never thought of root beer coming from an actual plant before. Mrs. Tibbetts heads farther down the trail, and he runs to keep up. When the path skirts a swampy area, Ben sees the bright green shoots of a plant sticking up out of the marshy ground, like the ones behind his house. What's that? He asks. Skunk cabbage. Why do they call it that? Why do you think? She asks. Because skunks eat it? No, she laughs. Because if you break the leaves, the smell is just horrible, like a skunk. Want me to pick some for you to sample? No thanks, Ben says. I'll take your word for it. Try to stay right behind me on the trail, Mrs. Tibbetts advises. There are lots of plants and critters here that wouldn't appreciate being squashed by our big feet. Ben follows her, stopping to marvel at everything she points out. This isn't the Sonoran Desert, of course, but it is about 100 times more interesting than he had expected. You getting tired? Mrs. Tibbetts looks back at him. We've been out here for a while. We're looping back toward the house now. Ben shakes his head. He's lost track of time. Well, we're nearly there, just beyond those red maples. She skirts around a clump of trees and stops in a clearing in front of the pool of water about 20 feet across. The sun is glinting on the water. Here it is, she says. Here's what? Where the Spadefoots will be in a month or so. It just looks like a big puddle. It is. A special puddle called a vernal pool. Vernal means spring. The pool is only here in the spring, but a lot of things depend on it to live. Wood frogs, salamanders, fairy shrimp. Shrimp? Fairy shrimp. Tiny crustaceans about an inch long. And spadefoots. They only breed on one night. The rainiest night in April, and then they're gone. Where? Back underground. They're pretty private and only come out at night. The night they breed is about the only chance you have to see them. One night a year, and that's it. They're almost impossible to find. You can hear them, though, on that night. Really? Oh, yes, they make quite a racket. She sits down on a large rock by the pool and takes off her shoes, then pulls on the wading boots. Ben does the same. They are way too big for him, and when he stands up, he loses his balance. Ah, he says, trying not to fall over. But he ends up sprawling in the wet muck at the edge of the pool. His hands are muddy, his forearms are wet, and a rich, funky smell comes up from the monk. He tries to get up, but it's hard in the boots. He's on his hands and knees and feels stupid. He looks up at Mrs. Tibbetts. She's laughing. "Oh, for Pete's sake," she says, "it's not a swimming pool." Something about the way she says it makes Ben laugh, too. She reaches down a hand and pulls him up. His arms are smeared with wet mud. He rubs them on the front of his jacket. "You look like a creature from the Black Lagoon," Mrs. Tibbetts says. "Your mother will kill me." She hands him a bandana and he wipes the mud off his fingers. "At least my feet are dry," he says. Mrs. Tibbetts laughs again and wades out into the middle of the pool. Ben starts to follow. "Try not to stir things up," she says. She inches along, bending down and peering into the murky water, and Ben follows behind, feeling the cool of the water through the boots. Ben can't figure out what she's doing. "Do you see anything?" he asks. She doesn't answer. After several minutes, she says, "Look, over there." Ben wades over, and she points at a gooey-looking blob floating in the pond. Inside the clear goo are hundreds of little black dots. "What is it?" "Wood frog eggs." "Like the one I caught?" "Who knows? Maybe she's the one that laid them." "What are the black dots?" "The eggs." "There must be 1,000 of them." "About that many," Mrs. Tibbetts says. "Most of them won't make it." "Why not?" "Because they taste so good. Yum, yum." At least to the snakes. Ben stares at the mass of eggs. "Cool," he says. He shakes his head at himself. That sounded more like what Ryan would say. "Very cool," Mrs. Tibbetts answers. "And the Spadefoots are even cooler. They're my favorite." She stands up and rubs her back stiff from leaning over. They wade out of the mucky water and put their shoes back on. It feels good to be back in sneakers. They sit on the rock for a little while. The sun warms Ben's back. "It's nice here," he says. "Yes, very nice." Without another word, Mrs. Tibbetts gets up and heads down the path towards the house. "Let's get some lunch," she calls back to him. "Then I'll pay you and take you home." Ben had forgotten all about the money. He'd forgotten all about everything, even the birthday party. "Okay," he says, happily hurrying to catch up, toting the wet boots over his shoulder. As they come to the side of the house by the garage, a fancy car pulls into the driveway, and a woman wearing an expensive-looking coat gets out. Her hair is bright red. "Oh, for Pete's sake," Mrs. Tibbetts mutters. "I wonder what she wants." Ben, why don't you find something to do in the backyard for a couple of minutes while I talk to her?" We're going to stop here today and discuss more in Zoom. But I want you to think about Ben's day, his time with Mrs. Tibbetts. I made an inference as I was reading that he really enjoyed himself. Can you think of some text evidence that shows that Ben had a really good time?